what you're worth. Now go out and get what you're worth.
I'm gonna show you how great I am.
Welcome to the Steel City. Is everybody ready to go? Let's proclaim the greatest radio show. Jim Cella and Johnny Parlay with the facts. So relax, grab a drink, then let's kick back.
Welcome back, Pittsburgh. This is Jim Cella, and you are listening to The Spread. I am talking with my friend Brandon Desantis. He is our resident athletic trainer for the show. How are you doing today, Brandon?
Doing pretty well, man. Thanks for having me on again.
Hey, I love having you on, buddy. It's always a good time. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the three key injuries the Steelers had this year, or this week, with Ryan Shazier, Ike Taylor, and Jarvis Jones. We'll start out with Ryan Shazier. He hurt his MCL in, I believe it was his right knee. They're calling it an MCL sprain, I believe. What is the MCL and how does it differ from an ACL?
Well, first of all, the MCL stands for the medial collateral ligament. It's different than the ACL because it's considered extracapsular, which means that it's outside of the joint. The ACL is intracapsular, so it's inside the joint. Its main purpose is to support the inside portion of the knee, and it's usually damaged when someone hits the outside of the knee or rolls up on the outside of the leg.
How long does the average MCL sprain take to heal? I know you obviously didn't get to examine Shazier yourself, but just in your, experience with athletes.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on how bad it is. If it's a grade 1 sprain, something pretty small, it could be a week or two before he's back to full speed. If it's a little bit worse, maybe a grade 2, usually somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks before he's kind of back to 100%. Anything higher than that would obviously require surgery, which we know is not the case with him since he's not scheduled for surgery.
Right.
But yeah, it could be anywhere from a week or two to looking at a month or so.
Yeah, the early reports I think that I read have him out for sure this week, but only questionable I think for the weeks after. So let's hope that it's just the lowest grade. What kind of tests do they do to check the MCL, and what type of movements do you think will be hardest during his rehab?
Well, testing the MCL is done by creating what's called a valgus stress at the knee, and this is done by, if it's his right knee, placing one hand on the outside part of the knee, and then having one hand on the inside part of the lower leg, and really all you're doing is creating a fulcrum almost. So you're trying to basically stabilize the outside of the knee and push the lower leg out, and trying to put stress on the inside of the knee. If you have pain with that, that's considered a positive test, and for pretty much every professional, they're going to confirm that with an MRI,
right?
That they'll do after the game. But it's a pretty simple test, actually.
All right, moving on to Ike Taylor. Did you get to see the Ike injury at all?
I did, yeah. And my first thought when it happened in real time is that he dislocated it. It just was kind of a weird presentation. When he was on the ground. Obviously, when seeing the replay, it was pretty clear that he broke it. And from a Steelers fan perspective, that was pretty hard to watch.
Yeah, it looked like it almost flopped around a little bit in the slow motion replay. That was kind of creepy.
Yeah, and I think what you were seeing was that bone actually breaking in slow motion, which was kind of crazy.
Yeah.
And it's also hard to watch from an athletic trainer's perspective because that. You can pretty much tell what happened, and you can tell how bad it was, and it's just unfortunate for him.
And I'm not a professional, like you, but when I saw the injury, I thought his forearm shattered. Quite honestly, it looked so bad. But then later in the game, you seen him on the sidelines with just a cast on and a sling holding it up. Do they have the technology, at the stadiums to set the bone and cast it and everything right there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Pretty much every stadium these days has an X-ray machine in the stadium as well as an X-ray technician for every game, so they can know pretty quickly the extent of the injury. Obviously, it wasn't anything that they had to send him to the emergency room for for a surgery or anything like that. But yeah, once they find the X-ray, team physicians are able to reduce it, realign it, and then re-x-ray it again to make sure that the bone is kind of set back in the right place. And then once they figure out that it is, the doctors and athletic trainers are able to apply a cast. And then, luckily we got to see him back on the sidelines, so we know that it wasn't an emergency, a medical emergency where they needed to, transport him to the ER.
The Steelers did not place Ike on IR. They used the injured reserve designation for Jones, so they're actually going to keep him on the active roster. He'll be on the 53-man roster every day. How long do you think it'll be before he's back?
Well, Jim, keep in mind that normal fracture healing is going to take somewhere between 8 and 12 weeks for that full healing to occur. Again, it depends on what kind of fracture it was, how displaced it was, in other cases if it requires surgery. But, the general fracture healing time somewhere between 8 and 12 weeks. I've worked with athletes who have returned earlier than that, and those guys are usually still in a cast. The cast will need to be heavily padded, obviously, for all football activity. So, I'm not exactly sure when he'll be back.
Right.
The exact injury, but knowing that that's kind of the time frame that you're looking at, if it's safe for him to come back before that, obviously he'll have to have a good amount of protective wear on that just to make sure that it doesn't get any worse.
Yeah, that actually leads me to my next question. I was going to ask if he does try to come back early or even just in his regular time frame, do you think he will wear a protective cast just maybe for the rest of this season?
Yeah, definitely. I've worked with guys who have fractures of some sort, usually hands, fingers, that kind of stuff. And even when they're out of the cast for activities of daily living, just tying your shoes, all that kind of stuff that you do around the house, we usually will have a removable cast that they wear for football activity just so they have extra protection. So I imagine when he returns, whenever that time may be, that he'll have either a cast or a splint or something on.
Now, like I said a little bit ago, Jarvis Jones, he had the wrist injury. They put him on the IR designated to return list, which means he'll miss at least 8 weeks. Do you think that's enough time for him to fully recover?
That's a really good question. I've looked into it a little bit, and they're not exactly saying what the injury is. I'm assuming that it's some sort of fracture that was requiring surgery. Maybe, it was a displaced fracture, or, even there's certain ligaments in the wrist that if you tear them completely, they need to be fixed by having a surgery done. So I'm not sure that he'll be 100% in 8 weeks, but clearly this is something they felt comfortable with him coming back and being able to return this year, or they wouldn't have designated him that way and, potentially mess around with the roster, waste a roster spot in that kind of way. So obviously it's something he needed surgery for, so it's going to be a little bit more long-term than, if he just had a small hairline fracture. But hopefully he'll be able to come back and, make an impact.
So what types of exercises do they do in rehab to fix the wrist injury like that?
Well, just in general, anyone that has an injury, the main things you're going to work on right away are keeping the swelling down, increasing range of motion, increasing strength, and stability too. It differs a little bit depending on the position. I mean, luckily he's a linebacker. He's using his wrist constantly, but it's not something that he has to have. Like a quarterback, is wrist motion is extremely imperative to the throw motion and being able to control the ball, especially if it's in the throwing hand. So luckily for him, he doesn't need to have the same type of dexterity that another player would have to have. That's something too that they might cast up and they might protect, and he'll just kind of have a club out there and be able to make some tackles as long as he can chase some guys down. But they're definitely going to be working on strength, and they're definitely going to be working on stability, because without having those built back up, he's really at risk for further injury.
Well, again, you lead me right into my next question. Do you think when Jones comes back, he'll have to wear one of those big clubs that you see? And what exactly is that? Is that like all tape? Is there a brace under that? What do they do to make that so stable that they can go out there and play?
Well, again, anybody that's coming back from any type of fracture or surgery is going to have some sort of protection. We talked about Sam Bradford wearing the knee brace. Right. We talked about Ike probably having a removable cast or splint. Any of these guys, they're going to have some sort of protection, just because, like we talked about in the last show, the greatest risk for further injury is previous injury. And these guys having it and trying to return, they're at a greater risk. So the protection is imperative. And the club is usually just a combination of a few different things. Everyone kind of has their own style, but normally at the base of it, it's some sort of cast or splint, and then everyone sort of uses a different kind of padding. I traditionally use a thicker kind of pad. It's essentially just foam, about a half an inch to an inch thick, and then the outside is obviously covered in tape to kind of hold it all down. But in the past, I've used bubble wrap, things like that. I mean, you can get kind of creative with it as long as it's thick enough and going to give him some protection. And also, you have to protect the other players as well. If you have a guy running around with a cast on his arm,
He could do some damage.
he could definitely do some damage. So it's not only for his protection, but it's for the protection of other players. And that's why before every game, anybody that's wearing a cast has to be cleared by the referees to make sure that it's safe for them and it's safe for the other players who are playing.
So of the 3 injuries, which do you think is the worst and which will be the hardest to come back from?
Well, unfortunately, none of these injuries are really good to have. From a time loss perspective, the MCL sprain is probably the least intense and I guess the best to have. MCL damage is not nearly as severe as a broken bone. However, the flip side of that is that the knee is an extremely weight-bearing joint, and more stress is going to be placed on it while playing football, especially at the linebacker position, trying to drop into coverage, trying to plant, cut, twist, all that kind of stuff. But I would definitely prefer to have some mild ligament damage at any position rather than a fracture that's going to require casting, surgery, and more major time loss. You're looking at probably 2 months or so.
Well, Brandon, I want to thank you again for coming on to the show and talking with us about these injuries. I know the fans always like listening to it. They can learn a little bit. I can learn a little bit, have a little bit of fun. But before I let you go, our Pittsburgh Steelers are 2-1. I definitely didn't see them beating Carolina last week. Did you get to watch the game?
I did, yeah. Luckily, it was a Sunday night game, primetime game. I was able to catch it. It looked great. First half was a little slow, as usual.
Yeah.
But the defense really picked up, and man, it was awesome just to see them kind of getting back to that old style of Steelers defense, just ferocious, tenacious. Everybody getting the ball, just everybody making an impact. It was awesome to see.
They were actually tackling people out there. That's what I was most impressed with. When they hit somebody, they wrapped them up and brought them down. They didn't just bounce off of them like Pac-Man or something.
Yeah, again, I'm not an expert on football. Obviously, I'm not a coach or anything like that. But man, it looked like the Steelers' defense from a few years ago when they went to the Super Bowl those couple years. 2 out of 3 years, and it just looked like that old style that we're used to, and it was awesome.
Yeah, it was definitely fun to watch. Well, hey, thanks again for coming on the show, Brandon. It sucks that we have to have somebody get hurt to bring you on. Maybe one day we'll just bring you on to talk a little football instead of all the devastating injuries that we come up with.
Yeah, glad to be on the show. Glad to help out, and definitely fun to be a part of. Thanks, Jim.
Hey, you have a great night.
You too, man.
Later.